terms of the legacy of the Hasmoneans and their state and their, after the rebellion against the Greeks, their reassertion of sovereignty, their reassertion of Judaic faith and political power. We got into the history. Now we're talking the evidence, the archaeology. Andrea, you're talking about the site that you've researched very heavily, firsthand, probably the world's expert on it. And you indicate that this was primarily a Phoenician site, which is very new because it goes against histories, whether they be ancient or modern, that have that area mainly Seleucian or trading hands between the Seleucids and the Judeans. There's no history of that being Phoenician, but yet your evidence shows that it was very Phoenician.
That's right.
What about the evidence of the Hasmonean footprint, if you will, in other parts of Judea?
We have evidence that in the time of John Hyrcanus, so that is not in the time of the revolt, but in the time of, the son and then his sons, the Hasmonean dynasty, because by then they were a dynasty,
yes,
had begun investing in a large patch of real estate in Jericho, a natural oasis just north of the Dead Sea, which is a lovely area, very well watered.
Still is.
It's still, and warm even in the winter because it's so low since it's down.
Palm trees.
That's right.
I think they have gambling there now. Anyway.
Well, yes, well, so it's always been an alluring spot for elites to gather and to live, and we have a huge set of remains from the Hasmonean, these dynasts, John Hyrcanus and Alexander Jannaeus and his sons. There are swimming pools, and there are gardens, and there are pavilions. It was pretty
And that's
nice.
really confirmed as being Hasmonean.
It really has to be, because Jericho was a place with a very, very valuable agricultural commodity, which was balsam, that was used to make perfume. And it was at various times a royal monopoly.
Okay.
It couldn't, it's unlikely that a set of estates of that architectural size and splendor and their economic prosperity would have been allowed to be owned and built on by anybody other than whoever was politically in charge of the land. And by the time that we have that evidence, we know the Hasmoneans are in charge of the land because we have their coins.
Okay. So we have concrete evidence that the Hasmoneans did exist. I mean, and we have evidence from several sources, Josephus among them, that there was this dynasty starting with Judah and then Simon, Hyrcanus, and then on.
So I'll back up. So the evidence that we have, the evidence that you're talking about and that Yonder was referring to and that we're basing all of these stories on, that evidence is, the best evidence is this one big book, the book of First Maccabees, which is in large part the source for Josephus. So it's not as if Josephus is a different source. Josephus actually...
He borrowed from that.
Copies and supplements it with Nicholas of Damascus.
Okay.
And it's written down in the time of John Hyrcanus.
Okay.
That is to say, it's a dynastic history written to explain and justify the background to the kingship of John Hyrcanus.
So Hyrcanus, being like a lot of powerful rulers, he wanted a history book that made him look good and
made his family look good and made his reign justified.
Of course.
Exactly. It's a legitimating piece of you could call it propaganda. I mean, of course it has to have valuable evidence for what really happened in it, because otherwise we don't have anything. But the way that the evidence is presented is clearly intended to persuade that from the beginning the Maccabees led the rebellion, which may not be the case, and that they had the support of a majority, if not all, of the people, save these lawless men who went after the Greeks. And it's a very interesting way to portray the Hasmoneans, given how Greek they were. as Greek, if not more Greek, than Jason and Menelaus and others that they criticize.
were?
Yes, the
What?
evidence for that is very abundant at Jericho. So this palatial compound
Well,
at
they might
Jericho,
have become more Greek, I mean, as the generations went on, but I mean, Metzisyahu and them, they weren't, wasn't that the whole?
This is a really beautiful legend that makes that allows the tradition to develop in the way that you've presented it. You know, they're pure Jews defending a beleaguered
people against
and
this, incursion.
assaulted
well, that's the story.
religion
Yeah.
against these impure, defiling, lawless ones. So they're the minority standing up for the tradition, and they win. That's the story that they want to present. But in fact, they're as Greek.
Well, but wait a minute. The fact is that however it came about, Judaism was restored under the Hasmoneans, and it sort of set the...
Some would say created.
Well, created, I mean, it had already been there. I mean, it was there brought back by Ezra, but I would think, at least
The centrality of the Torah, the observance of
Well, that
certain
came
food
later, though.
laws
That
and
came with the
other things.
rabbis, and then they brought you know, especially after the temple. But none of that would have happened had the Hasmoneans not put forth a vigorous state that kind of fended off.
Their achievement can't be minimized, and I think it's
Well, I would say,
but how they did it is really worth investigating, because it's really fascinating how much slippage there is between what's in the text and what we see in the ground, for example.
But there's something else that there is another completely other way that you could see it all. There's lots of archaeological evidence that the kind of piety among regular folks,
Right.
not priestly piety, not some small schools where rabbis are talking with scholars and students, but sort of widespread acceptance of a lifestyle and a set of beliefs that inform daily life. There's evidence that that doesn't actually begin until the early 1st century BC. That is 100 years after the time of the Maccabean revolt, and it's not impossible to see the development of that as a reaction to the Hasmoneans and not fostered by them.
Exactly.
But wait a minute, I want to just look at that a little bit more here. What about before the Hasmoneans, Ezra and Nehemiah coming back after getting the decree from Cyrus the Great and reestablished the temple?
So the word that we use to describe the people who come back, the word that is in the text, are Judeans.
Right.
Not Jews. Judeans.
Well, the word Jew
meaning,
correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the first use of the word Jew was in Esther.
No.
Okay.
Because the word Jew is English. And this is actually at the heart of one of the big controversies. People were called in the ancient world by where they came from.
Right.
There were Tyrians, there were Sidonians, there were Romans,
Right.
there were Athenians, and there were Judeans. And like I said earlier, different places had different deities protecting their cities.
Sure.
Athens had Athena.
Right.
Tyre had Melkart.
Mm-hmm.
And Judea had Yahweh.
God. Yeah.
They had Yahweh. And he was the patron of Judea. And the people who came and went from Judea were Judeans. And it was a process before they came to, people outside of that region came to share a sensibility and a lifestyle and a set of daily beliefs that united them no matter where they were from.
Yeah, but weren't they set off from the other nations even then in terms of belief, because they didn't have the physical, the anthropomorphic images? I mean, I know that the whole struggle of the Old Testament is of the 5 books of Moses is this battle between the wanting to have that and wanting to be believers in God.
Well, I think the little figurines that you brought up and asked me about
Right.
before, the Asherot. Well, the Asherot, the little female figurines, the fertility figurines, and the fact that there is such a repeated insistence in the by the biblical writers that the king of Judah must over and over assert the dominance and centrality of Yahweh in Jerusalem. That evidence pretty strongly shows that there was something to fight against, that people were
But by
not
the
following
time
along
Ezra
with that.
got back to Judea, though, I don't think there was the same struggle with idol worship at that point. I mean, at least not from the texts, or maybe, this was more the Canaanite period when they were tempted by all of the pleasures of the idol worship and everything that was going on around that, versus the belief in the ineffable, invisible God.
I think there's a common tendency to mistake the ideal that the Bible presents, and also that First Maccabees presents,
Or the book of Ezra, or any book.
any of these ancient literatures, the ideal for the reality, when actually the books don't claim that they're representing what really is. Frequently,
They're making a case.
Deuteronomy, Leviticus, the Deuteronomistic history, they all present Israel and Judah as nations that have, from the beginning, gone astray, committed adultery with other gods.
But they're struggling. I mean, the whole thing is the struggle between going astray and then coming back. And
But
when they come back, they're powerful, and then they go astray.
You have one king in the book of Kings who really gets it right, and that's Josiah. He's the only king who does a complete reform.
Yeah.
And when it's time for him to do that, what does he have to do? It's a lot of heavy lifting. He has to bring out the Asherah, image of Asherah and Yahweh from the temple, the images of the hosts of heaven, the Baals, the horses of the sun.
But the thing that made a difference, I mean, none of them probably got it right because they're all human, but the thing that made it different was that they knew that it was wrong. Even Manasseh, who was seen as one of the worst and most evil of the Davidic kings, he knew, especially at the end of his life, that he was wrong.
But, I want to say that one of the big problems with this entire conversation is the repeated use of the word they, as if there's one they, as if there's some monolithic, singular. It would be like saying today, President Obama speaks for all Americans, or any particular presidential candidate speaks for some gigantic monolithic group, and we know that's not the case. But if you only had, from the year 2015, one person's version of what was going on in the United States at this moment, you would think there was a they, a single they, a monolithic they, and there's not.
And you could mistake, like Donald Trump is restoring America's greatness.
Let's not talk about Donald Trump.
This is exactly the kind of rhetoric that you find in the biblical text and in First Maccabees. They're restoring something that was lost, but it's lost. That's the great consistency. It's never actually present.
The thing I take issue is that, of course there was imperfections. I mean, the human being is not perfect, but there was this ongoing tension and struggle to try to move toward that. I mean, yes, of course, the people had the Asherah, fertility dolls, but they didn't view that. They were kind of a little different about it. They didn't think it was good.
I don't think that. How
do you know?
That's where
because
the assumptions
my
are.
evidence of that is simply the writings. I mean, the writings.
And you have to assume that everybody bought that argument, but clearly they didn't. In fact, you have evidence.
I guess there's one piece of evidence I'd point to. And that is the fact that Judaism has survived as a religion that's different than the surrounding nations. We didn't embrace. I mean, we've certainly had our failings, and we're not monolithic, of course. We're all different. We relate to it differently. But I'm talking about the basic principles, the moral and ethical code of Sinai, the belief in a creator of the universe and a lawgiver that's outside of idol worship.
I think that it's absolutely the case that there are a few common pillars. Once Judaism develops as a religion, irrespective of where people live, which happens more or less in the period that we're talking about. Once that happens, there are a few common pillars. There is, while the temple still stands, a belief that there can be a home on earth for Yahweh.
Right.
There is a sense that there's a narrative past that all can relate to, and that past is recounted in the scrolls. That's, in fact, among the many contributions that the Dead Sea Scrolls have made to our understanding of what people were really thinking about then. We know that they actually had scrolls. They had canonical works, so they all agreed on a certain history.
Right.
There was an agreement that people should come together once a week and sit quietly and study.
I would add one more thing to it, and that is that there was also an understanding that there were moral and ethical precepts that came from Sinai.
Yes, I think that's probably true.
And that these, people didn't live up to it. We still don't live up to it. But it's something that is seen as outside of the manipulation of the state, which is what idol worship represented. The king, the idol was kind of like a ventriloquist. I mean, the king and the powers would manipulate that to say whatever they wanted it to say, whereas the unique contribution of the Judean cult, if you will, was that there was something bigger, that you could not be
not everybody
manipulated.
Really participated in that belief. But look,
no, they didn't. But they held it up as an ideal. To measure themselves.
The great achievement of Judaism that I appreciate is its inclusion of many, many different voices within a single tradition. And if you look at the Talmud or the Mishnah and the Bible, Mark Brettler argues that the Torah itself is put together deliberately with the purpose of including as many diverse voices as possible, so that creation is narrated from this perspective of the priest and this perspective of the Yahwist, and the 10 Commandments are given in 3 different forms, and so on, in order to bring as many of the people who do come from this people into a single fold. It doesn't mean that there's agreement. To the contrary, it's tremendously fractious, and arguments are up all the time. But somehow, with all of that chaos, there's something recognizable in all the participants. That's an achievement.
There's one other thing that I would say, and this could bring us back to the Maccabees, and that is that in all of the points, this the kind of fractured many voice point, and plus the other pillars that we were just talking about, there's something that's not there. It's not explicit anyway, and that is that you do not have to live apart from others, and you do not have to shun the political authority of others. That is not part of the covenant. And so one of the issues with the Maccabees, and they are not the only people to arise like this in Jewish history, but they're the ones that we started talking about here, is that they add the Maccabean narrative, the Hasmonean narrative, adds on. It adds on to this notion of Judaism, the idea that everybody else stay away and it will only be us. And if you are living within our territory, you have to be like us or you have to move.
Well, isn't that also, though, Joshua crossing the Jericho?
No.
Wasn't that Abraham going to the land that God showed him? I mean, it was sort of like they had to defeat the Canaanites.
They live among strangers, and it's okay.
But at the same time, they had to take sovereignty in that country. I mean,
sovereignty is not part of the necessary deal. People, at various periods, for various reasons,
this is important. So what you're saying then is that the contribution of the Hasmoneans was to have a very unified state where there would be only one people.
You could call it contribution.
And that, well, I wouldn't say, I agree with you.
I would not.
But no, I'm not saying it's good. I'm not judging it. I'm just simply pointing out that, and that Hyrcanus represents that, because he had demanded that people convert to Judaism, and that this was
forcibly.
So then it became like it's kind of the darker side of a sovereign state.
Yeah, not kinda.
Okay. I just, interesting.
But you do have resistance to the Romans and to the Maccabees in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Profound resistance, which is unusual. You know, the other...
I don't know if it's unusual. We just happen to know about
well,
it.
At the time, I guess at the time you do have the eruption of resistance to imperial rulers, but Jews had learned to live with empire, within empire.
Sure, they had been living with empire for 350 years.
If not before.
Yes.
And I was just talking with some students about this recently, just today, as we were conversing about this conversation. The Maccabean, 70 years of sovereignty is the only 70 years that you have in between Babylon and the modern state of Israel.
Right.
Actually, I could be wrong on this one too, but there was a brief sovereign period right at the end of the Byzantine Empire, before the Muslim conquest, when there was a rebellion, and it was sort of sponsored by the Sassanian Persians.
But you don't mean.
There was,
but it wasn't Judean.
Yeah, it was. I mean, that's what I understand. It was suddenly they had sponsorship from the Sassanians. There was then the Byzantines came back, who were very bad.
Yeah.
They came in. They started.
So this is post 614, right? Between 614
that's
and
right.
Muslim
They came back. They started
640.
slaughtering Jews, and then they welcomed the Muslims, because they came 15 years later, and the second caliph actually was extremely tolerant. But there was like a brief reassertion of sovereignty there.
Anyway, it's fleeting.
Anyway, yeah, of course.
And the Maccabees do this, and what's their contribution? They're hated by the end. They are regarded as horribly impious, transgressive of the law. Not Alexander only, but John Hyrcanus, because of Jericho, in fact, is condemned by the Dead Sea Scrolls as the one prophesied by Joshua after the conquest. Cursed be the one who rebuilds this city at the price of his firstborn, and upon his youngest he will lay the foundation and raise the wall. John Hyrcanus rebuilds Jericho, and in a single year, 104 to 103, Aristobulus and Antigonus get into a war.
Between the brothers.
The youngest dies, the oldest dies. Well, actually, they're not. It's not quite the oldest and the youngest, but the oldest dies, and the middle. Alexander Jannaeus, who was sort of prophesied in a dream, he has to be brought back from Galilee to. And
he turned out to be a very evil king.
Yeah.
But I think at the same time, just the very fact that sovereignty had been reasserted, it gave the Jewish people a breathing space. They were able to, advance their existence.
A breathing space for what?
To reassert their both faith and also their identity, even within all this turmoil.
At the time that Hyrcanus sets about on his military campaign to forcibly Judaize the land, nobody is imperiling the religious beliefs and practices of anybody.
Well, he was expansionist. He wanted to...
Right. I just mean, for you to explain his motivations in that way, or to justify them in that way...
Well, I'm kind of talking almost about what was going on besides the kings of Hyrcanus, and just the fact that you had the existence of a sovereign state with the temple, with the worship. It helped Judaism consolidate itself. It gave birth to the rabbis. And
Chuck, the author of First Maccabees has done his job on you.
It's a successful piece.
Maybe that's why First Maccabees. And it's interesting that those two books, First and Second Maccabees, are not part of the Jewish canon, but they are part of the Catholic canon.
Yeah. That's right.
Why is
not
that?
The Protestant?
Why is that? Why is that, Yonder?
Wow, that's an interesting. It's an interesting question.
Yeah.
They are. They're tucked away in the Apocrypha, so.
But yet the Catholics put it up as a kind of canon. I mean,
sure, and it's read in the regular liturgy. First Maccabees has about 51 verses that are read every 2-year cycle.
But why in the first place?
But why the Catholics and not the Jews on that?
Yeah.
Well, it's not in. I mean, the speculation is that in Judaism it doesn't come into the canon first because of the reputation of the Hasmoneans. They're not good.
Right. They're bad guys.
There are two good ones. There's Mattathias and there's Judah.
And Simon.
No, Simon gets a bad rap because he arrogates kingship to himself.
Anyway, we're reaching toward the end of the program, so just where can people get information about the Maccabee Project?
If you Google the Maccabees Project, you'll come up to our website, and you'll probably also get our Facebook page.
Okay.
And events are posted there regularly. Summaries of past events are posted there. Recordings of events. So when we have discussions at either BC or BU, we record them, and we post audio and video there. So
and you're doing symposium, and you're speaking,
right?
And you've got research, you've got scholars, and it's an ongoing project.
Right, and you can sign up to be on our mailing list and find out about events for the comfort of your own email inbox.
Wonderful. Well, I hope it kindles re-interest in history and this particular period of history.
Debate is what we're interested in, and I think we've done
just that.
Okay.
Thanks, Chuck.
My pleasure. So we should talk amongst ourselves.
What in love can you show me?